heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 323, covering the week of August 29th through September 2nd, 2022. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. The YouTube page is invaluable. It's got a lot of great free stuff on it, and of course I'm going to talk about that today. But you can go over to YouTube, subscribe to it. You can also donate to the Institute there. Just click on that little heart button under the videos, the super thanks button. We've got this podcast over there. Of course, we also have all of our lectures from our summer schools and other conferences. Our Abbeville U videos are over there, which are great. We've had a few of those come out recently, one on Faulkner, one on Jefferson and Hemmings, one on Jefferson Davis. A lot of really good stuff on the YouTube channel. And again, it's all free of charge. A lot like most of the stuff we do at the Institute. So let me say that if you do enjoy the Abbeville Institute, head over to abbevilleinstitute.org. This is ABBEVILLE, institute.org. Click on that donate button and give us a donation. It is tax deductible to the full extent of the law. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. And it does keep all of these things free of charge. Our website, our podcast, our YouTube page, all that material, our mobile app, which of course you can download. You can download the mobile app. You have access to our lectures in audio form, which is fantastic, right? All these lectures from our previous conference, over 200 lectures, free of charge through the mobile app. You can also get them online at the website too, but if you got the mobile app, you can listen to those lectures on that app. Amazing, right? Free of charge. So all that stuff is free, and your donations help us do that. You can also give us an email address while you're at abbevilleinstitute.org, and of course we'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition. A great resource, free of charge. Just give us that email address. And the email is how we keep in touch with you. We let you know about our forthcoming Zoom webinars. We have one next week, September 6th. We've got a Zoom webinar on R.L. Dabney, which is going to be fantastic, with Zachary Garris, who wrote a really good book on Dabney, Dabney on Fire. And so we're going to have him talk about Dabney. So that's a way you find out about those things. And of course, if you know about that, make sure you get on that, right? These Zoom webinars are not expensive. And then if you want to catch up on the Zoom webinars, go to abbevilleacademy.org. You can get all the previous Zoom webinars, anything you missed, they're all available there. And so you can purchase those as well. And of course, that does support the Institute. So lots of great ways to support the Institute. You can click on the shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org, get our logo and all kinds of cool stuff, high quality embroidered stuff. But as always, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Leave a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, comment on the lectures, comment on the podcast, because that helps the algorithm, gets people to see it and listen to it. And of course, your reviews, those 5-star reviews, let people see it. And we want to boost this up, and we want to listen to this podcast about the South. So it's a great way to help, but also share the material around on social media. That also helps. Let your friends know, your family know you listen to the Abbeville Institute, you read the Abbeville Institute. All those are painless and free ways to support the Institute. All right. Well, let's talk about the topics of the day, the week in review. A lot of good stuff. We know that as I'm recording this, Joe Biden has made a speech where he's denounced the deplorables in America. Now, where have we heard this before? Where we have political leaders actually stand up and call the other side evil. They call them a danger, a threat. Well, we heard it in the 1850s. We heard it coming out of Northerners, generally radical Republicans. This is Charles Sumner's 1856 speech, The Crimes Against Kansas, when he called Missourians vomit, when he called South Carolina the lowest form of civilization. We've seen it, right? And of course, Charles Sumner was not talking about all Americans. He wasn't talking about all Southerners, supposedly, but he was talking about particular Southerners and particular Americans. And of course, on the flip side of that, you could say, well, someone like Franklin Pierce would stand up and say that radical abolitionists were a threat to America, and that was going to incite violence. So we've got a situation in America which I see as very dangerous. We have a rhetorical war going on in the United States. And we have the incumbent president of the United States making speeches where he is going to denounce a large percentage of the American population and call them dangerous to America. That is a dangerous move. But again, we've seen this before, and hopefully we're not going to go down the path that happened there in terms of violence. Because in 1860, this is interesting, in 1860, you had many Southerners who believed that secession was the only peaceful remedy to the problem. Right? They believed that was it. It was going to be the peaceful way. Look, they hate us. We'll just leave. That was, in their mind, a peaceful solution to the problem. Now, there were Southerners who didn't think that. Look, Jefferson Davis is on record as saying, I didn't think secession was going to be peaceful. I thought that these fanatics in the North were going to attack us. Now, he did make statements, all we want to do is be left alone. We just want to be left alone. Please don't attack us. We're just trying to have our own government. We're just trying to get out of this union. You can have it. You can have the union. You still have the government. You still have the financial houses. You still have all of that. The real question came down to money. Lincoln didn't want to lose the money, the revenue, and not just the revenue, right? It wasn't that the South was paying an exorbitant amount of taxes that they were going to lose in the general government. It was the threat to the protective tariff. The protective tariff, if the South had left, would have been basically worthless in New York because you would have had European powers trading through southern ports because the South was not going to have any protective measures. In fact, those protective measures would have been essentially illegal. And so you would have had England and France and everywhere else trading through southern ports. And then, of course, the North would have had to trade with the South, but the North wouldn't have gotten the revenue off of those products. So there was a threat to the tariff. And this is something we often talk about. Well, the South is going to pay. We need to explain the tariff in that way because that's really the problem. This is what Lincoln was very concerned about. The loss of revenue from foreign trade going outside of New York or other northern ports into southern ports. That was going to be the problem. Phil Lee's done a very good job with this. If you don't follow Phil Lee, you should. Also, I'll tell you who did a great job with this years ago, 100 years ago plus, was Lyon Gardner Tyler, who wrote about this when he was talking about the real threat in the war, when economic threat was that loss of tariff revenue because people would trade with the free trade South and they would ignore northern protectionism. So the North was going to have to reduce their tariff to compete with a free trade federal republic right on their doorstep. So you got to follow the money, right? And we've had a couple of pieces this week that speak to that. One of the real problems in America in the antebellum period was the money. Now, the first thing I want to mention is the essay we published on Monday. There's a question about whether Spencer Rowan actually wrote this, one of the other members of the Richmond Hutto. But regardless, this was an attack on the Supreme Court decision in McCulloch v. Maryland and Fichteon's essay. And it was published in 1819. And if you read it, this is one of the best articulations of federalism you can find. The Richmond Junto, these Virginians, were very concerned about the powers of the central government. They were concerned about what that central government would do in the long run should it have unlimited power over financial institutions. Should it have unlimited power over the government in terms of what that would do to the internal affairs of the states. They were concerned about all of this. Now, you could say, well, that internal affairs means slavery. They were concerned about other things too, right? But when you read this McCulloch v. Maryland piece and Fichteon's denunciation of McCulloch v. Maryland, essentially what he's doing is restating the originalist position on the Constitution, how the Constitution was originally interpreted when it was ratified, and that would mean real federalism. The states have powers, the states have rights, they have the ability to control the central government. The central government cannot infringe on those powers or those rights, and essentially this is what they thought that was happening with this interpretation of the Constitution. It was essentially codifying Hamilton's very broad and wide-ranging review of the Constitution in his opinion on the Bank of the United States in 1791. That opinion, which of course he submitted to George Washington and Washington read in February of 1791, becomes the language that's used over the years to defend unconstitutional government in America. It's what John Marshall regurgitated. It's what Daniel Webster regurgitated when he was arguing for the bank. It's what all of these people regurgitated. Hamilton was the guy that they could point back to and say, this is how we're going to defend loose construction. This is how we're going to defend implied powers. And from that point forward, this is how it's always been done. Right? So what they were trying to do is draw a line in the sand in 1819 over the bank. right, over this unconstitutional federal corporation. It had nothing to do with slavery. It had everything to do with federal power. So when you go back to that and you look at 1819 and you follow it forward, Southerners were sounding the alarm for years about what would happen if the North gained control of the government and was able to use the general government in any way they chose to do anything they wanted and have complete control of their own powers through the general government. There was no check on these things. That's one of the real problems Southerners pointed out. It's what Calhoun pointed out, right? Calhoun was concerned there was no enforcement mechanism for the 10th Amendment. And so this is why he had the concurrent majority. And the concurrent majority was designed to protect minorities. The same thing that Joe Biden is blasting in this speech, minorities. We have majoritarianism, Biden says. And I'll if you listen to my podcast, the Brian McClanahan Show, I'll talk about that next week. In fact, it's going to be the Monday episode on the Joe Biden speech. So I don't want to steal all my thunder for that, but a lot of you may not listen to that show on this podcast. But Biden's speech is majoritarianism, and this is what Calhoun was against. He wanted to ensure that minorities, whatever minority it was, political minority, would be protected. And so this is the real design of the Constitution, to protect political minorities. And Calhoun recognized in the 1830s, by that point, that the South was going to be a permanent political minority. That once the general government was in control of the North, and once the general government was in control of these individuals, whether they were industrialists or commercialists or whatever it was, but Northern interests who were using nationalism as a real disguise for New England sectionalism, the South was going to be a permanent political minority. And so he designed the concurrent majority to ensure that minority interests were protected in the United States. The real object of a constitution, of a written constitution, is not to empower the majority to abuse the minority, but it's to empower the minority to check the power of a majority. It's to empower the minority to check unlimited power from the center. That's what the real design of a written constitution is. Now you can say, well, wait a second, isn't the king and an oligarchy, isn't that a minority? And so the Constitution doesn't allow these things, so it's more about majoritarian rule. Well, if you look at the structure of the U.S. Constitution, it's very clear that they're against majoritarianism. And the 10th Amendment was designed to ensure that whoever controlled the general government could not abuse the rights of minorities. And you could bring this down into modern era. We're talking about minorities. It could be any minority. It could be a political minority. It could be a racial minority. It could be a religious minority, an ethnic minority. Any kind of minority could be protected through the concurrent majority. The central government would have so few powers. Its powers would be so limited that it could do nothing except what a real majority, a super majority, would allow to happen. And so right now you're looking at a lot of legislation going through D.C. that doesn't have a supermajority stamp on it. It's 50% plus one. That's what we're getting. And so the minority is being abused. And this is what Biden's speech is all about. But so is the McCulloch v. Maryland position. So is the Amphictyon essay. So is Tom DiLorenzo's talk at the summer school, which we published on Thursday, Follow the Money. You had a group of interested parties in the North who knew that they would be crushed financially should the South leave the Union. And so this group, this financial group, was certainly willing to do whatever it took to keep the South in the Union. Now, what's interesting about that, what I find fascinating, again, when you look at Jefferson Davis and what he's writing and how he's talking about things, during the war, after the war, he was confused about this. He was really confused about why any financial interest would be against an independent South. Their money would still be secure because the South was still going to trade with them. So you're talking about textile mill owners in the North. They still would have been able to acquire Southern products at a very low price, and it would have just been a different government. So it wasn't going to change anything, really. He was very perplexed, and I think a lot of Southerners were too, why the North, if you're talking about factory interests, why they would be so against an independent South. But again, it came down to tax revenue. It came down to control of the government. It came down to a territory, limits. And this is what was said by the radical Republicans often when they talked about it. John Bingham, for example, said, look, I believe that everyone agrees with me, that it doesn't matter what we're talking about. South Carolina is mine. It's not South Carolina's. It's my land. And you see this now, right? People talk about, well, we can't have secession because that's mine. Even if you don't live there, that's mine. That's mine. It's not theirs. They don't own it. They don't control it. Of course, these people don't live in South Carolina, for example, don't pay any South Carolina taxes, don't have anything to do with the government there, don't have anything to do with the society there. But that's still mine. I want to go there whenever I want and be allowed to do whatever I want there. That's mine. It's a curious type of imperialism because I think Southerners don't ever wake up and say, you know what, Massachusetts is mine. Most Southerners would say, you can have it, right? They don't wake up and say, California is mine. You can have California, right? You can have Oregon if you want it. You can have Portland. Southerners look at that and say, God, I'm glad I don't live there. I'm glad I live where I do because I don't see these problems. I don't see the homeless camps in the street in Los Angeles or Portland, Oregon. I don't see all that. I don't wake up and say, you know, those lakes in Minnesota, those are all mine. I got lakes here in the South. Those are mine, right? Those lakes right here and wherever you live in southern state, those are your lakes. Those aren't anybody else's lakes. But it's a curious type of imperialism that you have where that's mine. And I think that's where you saw when DiLorenzo talks about follow the money. It's a great talk at our summer school. It's on YouTube now. So you can go out and listen to it. It's a fantastic lecture. Of course, Tom DiLorenzo is always funny. And he does a really good job bashing Lincoln and, of course, the Lincoln myth. And it's tremendous to have him as an affiliated scholar of the Institute because he's just so good on Lincoln. He wrote a recent book, The Problems with Lincoln from Regnery History, and which is an amazing turnaround for Regnery because years ago, I tried to pitch in one of my books, about a decade ago now, that I was going to call Lincoln one of the anti-heroes in America, and they rejected the idea. But now, in the last decade, they've seen that there's a market for this, right? There's certainly a strain of conservatism that has problems with Lincoln. And this is nothing new. I mean, people were writing about Lincoln and Lincoln's abuse of the Constitution. Real conservatives, this is the thing. The Republicans were careful to point out that they were not conservatives, that the conservatives, the Democrats, were against all of the innovations from the Republican Party. They called them conservatives. Now, they would put it in quotation marks, kind of like, well, these people are calling themselves conservatives. But that's what they were saying. The Democrats were calling themselves conservatives. And the Democrats were concerned about the influence Abraham Lincoln was having on the future of American government. They talked about it openly. If you want to go back and you want to see the lost cause, quote unquote, before the lost cause. See, it's often said, well, the lost cause is created in the period after the war. This is when Southerners were trying to justify their actions and they were lying about everything. If you want to find the lost cause before that, Democrats were speaking very much in terms of what we would call lost cause, the lost cause myth, during the war. They're saying, you know what this war is about? This war is about power. This war is about your power. It's not really about slavery. In fact, Republicans, when they were cornered on it, would admit it. Yeah, okay, we're not concerned about slavery so much. We're concerned about saving the Union because this is an attack on the government. And they didn't call it the Union. They called it the government. This is an attack on the government. Now again, what are we seeing in 2022? The Democrats are running around saying this is an attack on the government, right? This is the same kind of rhetoric. It's not really about the Union. It's about the government, their sacred government. In fact, lefties call it that now. They call the government sacred, which is what Lincoln was interested in doing in the 1830s in his Lyceum address when he said we should have a secular religion and it should be government. It should be sacred. So you point back to all of these things. Government becomes sacred. The founding documents become sacrosanct, particularly the Declaration, and their interpretation of it. And again, the Republicans were very open about this in the 1850s and saying 1860s, our interpretation of the Constitution is the Constitution as it is, not their interpretation, which is wrong. Our interpretation, the Constitution as it is. So that lecture that Tom DiLorenzo gave at the summer school, which is very good, on Lincoln, is something that you must watch. And we have more coming, right? We will filter these out and dribble these out over the next several weeks, and the lectures from the summer school. If you've never attended one of our conferences before, you should. And we're trying to put together a conference next winter, which I think will be a good one. And we're looking at doing something on Zoom in the fall, in the next several weeks, on Robert E. Lee. And speaking of Robert E. Lee, let's talk about one of the pieces we had this week on Lee. And they kind of work together, two pieces actually. The first is Jefferson Davis on Robert E. Lee. Now, Davis is an interesting character. And Davis is an interesting character because he survived the war. And he was an articulate man. He was someone interested in history. He wrote a lot. He wrote a lot before the war, but he particularly wrote a lot after the war. And oftentimes people say, well, this is just his lost cause defense of treason. This is his lost cause defense of this disastrous war. And we can't listen to this guy because he is not someone who's trustworthy. Jefferson Davis, and as we had in the video that we produced, was one of the most respected Americans in the United States in the antebellum period. This is a man who essentially built the U.S. Army as Secretary of War. This is a man who was a war hero. And in fact, when you go back and look at Davis, that was something that he was very proud of, his action in the Mexican War. This is a man who was married to Zachary Taylor's daughter. So the President of the United States for a time was his father-in-law, right? Of course, she died very quickly after their marriage, but they eloped because they didn't think they could get permission. I mean, it's kind of, it's an interesting love story, so to speak, but Davis was a well-respected individual, and he spent a lot of time after the war was over writing. In fact, that's what he bought. He bought his plantation on the Mississippi coast, Gulf Coast, which is still there, Beauvoir, and he spent a lot of time writing there. But he also sojourned in Europe and was interested in talking to groups and people. And so this particular piece, it's Jefferson Davis on Robert E. Lee. It was delivered in Richmond, Virginia on November 3rd, 1870. And of course, this is quickly following the death of Lee. And he had some really interesting things to say about Lee. I want to read the last three paragraphs. And I want to read the last three paragraphs because they also speak to something that we talked about last week, which is this Confederate monument in Fairfax, Virginia, which was put there in the courthouse square to honor the Confederate dead. They said it explicitly. So I want to know how all these people, Kate Nelson and some of the other dopes who run around writing that, these monuments were put up for white supremacy. They were put on State House grounds to ensure that white supremacy was going to be codified and black people were not welcome. There was no justice for black people. No, that's not what they were doing. It was the public place. So you put the monument there to honor the Confederate dead in the most public place you could. And they talked about it. And I want to read these last three paragraphs, because this is what Davis thought of Lee. He said, "But I shall not attempt to review the military career of our fallen chieftain. Of the man, how shall I speak? He was my friend, and in that word is included all that I could say of any man." Think about that. Think about that statement. Just ponder that for a second. It's so deep that you don't have, it takes time to mull that over. Friendship, real friendship, is timeless. It's priceless. And when you say someone is your friend, that's you live and die on that hill. That's your rock. And that's what Davis is saying. This is my friend. And that's all I could say of any man. He was my friend. These men went through something that no Americans since have gone through. Now, you could say this was the case in the founding period, the founding generation, pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And all those men were friends. But many of them were. And when you got to that point where it was, these are my friends, and this is who I'm going to live and die with, they meant it. And Davis meant it. This was his friend. These two went through one of the most difficult things anyone can go through. And they suffered together. Lee was never pardoned. Davis was never pardoned, not during their lifetimes. They were later, interestingly enough, by the 1970s. But regardless, and they didn't ask for it. They didn't ask for it. Davis never asked for it. Lee never asked for it. There was nothing to be pardoned for in reality. But certainly, they were men that had suffered together. And when you say he was my friend, that's all, that word is included in all I can say of any man. It's a beautiful statement. It really is. He says his moral qualities rose to the height of his genius. Self-denying, always intent upon the one idea of duty. Self-controlled to an extent that many thought him cold. His feelings were really warm, and his heart melted freely at the sight of a wounded soldier or the story of the suffering of the widow and orphan. This is the personal stories you get of Lee. He comes off cold because of his self-denying, self-control, self-denying personality. But Davis says this man was warm. This man was a real Christian gentleman. That's an important thing we talk about on Friday this week, the Confederacy and God, and how important religion was to these men, to these people, right? Not just the men, but the people of the South. During the war, he was ever conscious of the inequality of the means at his control, but it was never his to complain or to utter a doubt. It was always his to do. No complaints. We knew we were limited. We knew we had problems. Lee didn't complain. He just did. And he did to the best of his ability. And unfortunately, that ability and those resources were not enough to secure independence for the South. In Davis's mind, it wasn't enough. But it wasn't because he didn't try. It wasn't because he was a genius. He wasn't a genius. He was. They just were outgunned, outmanned, out-resourced. When in the last campaign he was beleaguered at Petersburg and painfully aware of the straits to which we were reduced, he said, quote, "With my army in the mountains of Virginia, I could carry on this war for 20 years longer." His men exhausted and his supplies failing, he was unable to carry out his plans. An untoward event caused him to anticipate the movement, and the army of Northern Virginia was overwhelmed. But in the surrender, he anticipated conditions that have not been fulfilled. He expected his army to be respected, and his paroled soldiers to be allowed the enjoyments of life and property. Whether these conditions have been fulfilled, let others say. He expected his soldiers to be allowed the enjoyments of life and property. A magnanimous surrender is what he expected. And Davis is saying, I don't know if we're going to have that. Now, think about that. For a time, you could say this happened. Confederate soldiers were respected. They were honored. They were brought back in the Union. But what's happening now? As we're taking down his monuments, and there's the last sentence that will bring a tear to your eye in this particular lecture, this talk that he gave, because it's what's happening now. Unfortunately, what he's saying is not the way people think about Lee anymore. Here he now sleeps in the land in the land that he loved so well. And that land is not Virginia only, for they do injustice to Lee, who believed he fought only for Virginia. He was ready to go anywhere, on any service for the good of his country, and his heart was as broad as the 15 states struggling for the principles that our forefathers fought for in the Revolution of 1776. So here again is Davis reiterating what they were doing was the same as the founding generation in 1776. He is sleeping in the same soil with the thousands who fought under the same flag, but first offered up their lives. Here the living are assembled to honor his memory, and there the skeleton sentinels keep watch over his grave. This citizen, this soldier, this great general, this true patriot, left behind him the crowning glory of a true Christian. His Christianity ennobled him in life and affords us grounds for the belief that he is happy beyond the grave. What a beautiful paragraph. I mean, people often talk about Lincoln as the rhetorician, as someone who could make great speeches. Jefferson Davis could make really good speeches. That's a beautiful paragraph. a beautiful statement about Robert E. Lee. And this is the person this is how people remembered him, right? And now we remember him in a different way. Traitor, slave owner, devil, evil. This is how the men of the time remembered Robert E. Lee. And then he says this, but while we mourn the loss of the great and the true, drop we also tears of sympathy with her who was his help. Meet in life the noble woman who, while her husband was in the field leading the army of the Confederacy, though an invalid herself, passed the time in knitting socks for the marching soldiers. Speaking, of course, of Robert E. Lee's wife, who was sick, an invalid, not able to do things, lost her home. We should cry, we should mourn for her. A woman fit to be the mother of heroes, and heroes are descended from her. Mourning with her, we can only offer the consolation of a Christian. Our loss is not his, but he now enjoys the rewards of a life well spent and an ever-wavering trust in a risen Savior. This day we unite our words of sorrow with those of good and great throughout Christendom, for his fame is gone over the water. His deeds will be remembered, and when the monument we shall build shall have crumbled into dust, his virtues will still live, a high model for the imitation of generations yet unborn. Now, of all the things that are happening, and I've said this before on this podcast, you can take down the monuments. You can take them all down. And I think this is where people despair over this. People despair because that image is now gone. And of course, the other side thinks they're winning. This is victory after victory. We're marching through. Truth is marching on, right? This is the battle hymn of the Republic just coming in 2022. What Davis is saying, the monuments don't matter. They don't matter. Because as long as we can talk about Robert E. Lee, as long as this particular paragraph exists, Lee will remain that symbol of the South, that symbol of the Christian hero and gentleman. As long as these things exist, Lee exists. I'm running a little long here. I'll say one more thing. The piece that we published on Wednesday, the best 200 Confederate books. It's a book about that topic that I scribbled a little few hundred words about. If you want to read the real Lee and the real Southern soldier and the real South, get the books on that list. There's a link to it. It's in public view, so you can go out and get those books. A lot of them are hard to get, but a lot of them are also free online because they're in public domain. So until next time, good day.